The night Elias Calloway found Clara Holt curled up on the cold pine floor of his trading post kitchen, her thin shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and her cheek resting against the bare planks like she had given up on asking the world for anything better. Something cracked open inside his chest that had been sealed shut for the better part of 7 years. The year was 1873, and the Rocky Mountain town of Ember Creek, Colorado, sat wedged between two granite ridges like a coin caught in a crack, high enough that the pines never quite lost their snow and cold enough in October that a man's breath came out in white ribbons even indoors. Ember Creek had sprung up around a silver strike 3 years prior, and it held onto its population the way desperate places always do, by becoming necessary. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a dentist's office on Wednesdays, and the Calloway Trading Post, which served as outfitter, supply depot, and the only establishment in 40 miles that sold decent coffee. Elias ran the trading post the way he ran everything, with his hands, his back, and a jaw set so firmly that most men in Ember Creek had given up trying to read his expression and simply trusted that if Elias Calloway said a thing was so, it was so. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders in a way that made door frames feel like an afterthought, with forearms corded from years of splitting wood, hauling freight, and wrestling the mountain into something that resembled a livelihood. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in loose waves he never seemed to get around to cutting, and his beard came in thick and full, threaded with a few early strands of copper when the light caught it just right. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something striking rather than softened into something pretty. A strong jaw, deep-set gray eyes the color of storm clouds over the peaks, and a permanent squint that came not from meanness, but from years of reading the horizon. He had built the trading post himself, log by log, 4 years before Clara arrived in Ember Creek. He had built the kitchen addition the 2nd year, the storage barn the 3rd, and the small bunkhouse at the back of the property the 4th. He had done all of it alone, which was not a point of pride so much as a statement of fact. Elias Calloway had learned early that the only things that stayed were the things you built yourself, and he had spent the better part of his adult life making sure he had enough of those to fill the silence. Clara Holt had come to Ember Creek in the last week of September 1873 on the twice-monthly supply wagon from Denver, sitting up on the bench beside the driver with a carpet bag in her lap and the expression on her face that Elias would later describe, if pressed, as a woman who had decided that wherever the wagon stopped was better than where she had been. She was 23 years old, slim but strong in the way that women who worked became strong, with dark auburn hair. She kept pinned up under a calico bonnet and eyes the color of amber, warm brown shot through with gold when the light came through the window right. She had fine features and a mouth that looked like it was designed for smiling but had not been given much reason to lately. She had walked into the trading post carrying her carpet bag and asked, with more steadiness than her situation seemed to warrant, whether there was work available. She could cook, she said. She could bake bread, render lard, make stew from whatever was on hand, and she had worked in a railroad camp kitchen for 2 years before coming here, so she was not delicate about heat or noise or demanding men. Elias had studied her for a long moment with those storm-gray eyes, and then he had said, "Room and board, and 40 cents a day. You cook breakfast before 6, dinner at noon, supper at 7. There's a storeroom next to the kitchen that has a cot. If you steal from me, I'll know it." Clara had looked back at him with those amber eyes and said, "If I were a thief, I'd have found easier marks than a trading post in the mountains." He had nodded once, the way a man nods when he recognizes a fair point, and that had been that. The first week, they moved around each other with the careful courtesy of two people who have both been burned enough to be polite about personal space. Clara cooked, and she cooked well. Her biscuits were light enough to make the trappers who came through look confused and grateful all at once, and her venison stew had enough depth to it that Elias ate 2 bowls the first evening and then went back to splitting wood with the energy of a man who has been properly fed for the first time in longer than he realized. She kept the kitchen cleaner than it had ever been, and she organized the supply shelves with a logic that actually made sense, grouping like things together so that when a man needed cornmeal, He found it without dismantling the whole operation. Elias noticed these things. He was a man who noticed things. He did not always say what he noticed, but the noticing happened all the same, quietly and consistently, the way a man who has spent years in wilderness learns to observe without announcing himself. What he also noticed, though he said nothing about it for the first several days, was the sound of Clara moving around the kitchen long after the supper dishes were done. He could hear it from the main room of the trading post where he sat doing his ledger work in the evenings, the soft footsteps, the sound of a pan being set down carefully, the occasional sound of her voice murmuring something he could not make out, like she was talking to herself or to some quiet companion only she could hear. He did not intrude on these evenings. Whatever she was working through in those hours after supper was her own business, and he respected that. He also noticed that she was thin. Not fragile thin, but the kind of thin that comes from months of not having quite enough, the way her wrists looked in the lamplight when she reached past him to set the bread on the shelf, the way her cheekbones were just a bit too prominent. He started putting slightly more on her plate at supper without comment, sliding the bowl across the table before she could serve herself a smaller portion, and she accepted this without drawing attention to it, which told him she had enough pride to be difficult about charity and enough sense to eat when food was offered. The second week, they started talking. Not much. A comment about the weather, a question about the supply inventory, a brief exchange about what she needed from the dry goods to make the pie she was planning. But it was talk, and it had a different quality than the functional silence of the first week. It had a little bit of the real people behind the functional roles, and Elias found himself more than once, in the evening after his ledger work was done, standing in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen just a beat longer than he needed to, listening to her tell him something about the way they had done bread in the railroad camp or about the particular stubbornness of high-altitude yeast. On the evening of the 17th day of her employment, a Thursday, Elias came into the kitchen to put away the last of the dry goods delivery that had arrived that afternoon and found Clara sitting at the kitchen table with a letter in her hands. She was not crying, but her eyes had that bright, still quality that meant the crying had either already happened or was being held back by the kind of discipline that comes at a cost. She looked up when he came in, and she straightened her spine with that deliberate composure he was starting to recognize as characteristic of her. "Pardon me," she said, folding the letter quickly. "I will be out of your way in a moment." "You're not in my way," he said, and he meant it plainly, without comfort or condescension, just as a statement of the same weight as anything else he said. She nodded, but her hand stayed tight on the folded letter, and he set the dry goods on the shelf without hurrying, giving her the cover of ordinary activity. "Someone from home?" he asked after a moment without turning around. There was a pause. "My sister," she said, "from St. Louis." He turned then and leaned against the shelf with his arms crossed over his chest, not pressing but not retreating either. "Good news or bad?" Clara looked at the letter and then at him, and something in her face shifted, a slight softening, the kind that comes when a person decides to trust just far enough to say the next true thing. She married. A man I warned her about. She married him anyway, and she sounds happy, and I do not know whether to be glad for her or frightened. "Both seem reasonable," he said. She looked at him with a slight expression of surprise, as though she had expected either empty comfort or no engagement at all. "Yes," she said slowly, "both seem reasonable." He pushed off the shelf and went back to the main room, and she went back to her kitchen, and they did not discuss it further. But something had shifted, and they both knew it. The third week of October in Ember Creek was when the cold genuinely arrived, not the cool, manageable chill of September that a good coat and a fire could handle, but the real cold, the kind that settled into the bones of the mountain and did not intend to leave until April. The trading post had a main fireplace that kept the front room warm, and a wood stove in the kitchen that Clara kept going from before sunrise to well after supper. But the storeroom where Clara slept was separated from the kitchen by a short corridor, and while it had a small window and a door that closed, it did not have a heat source of its own. Elias had not thought about this with the particular intention that would have made him feel responsible. He had simply never had a cook before who lived in that room, and the winter had not been upon them when Clara had agreed to the arrangement. But by the third week of October, with the temperature dropping below freezing at night and the wind coming off the peaks in long, steady rushes, he was aware, in the way he was aware of most practical things, that the storeroom was likely uncomfortable after the kitchen fire died down. He had meant to ask her about it. He had meant, specifically, on the evening of October the 22nd, to ask whether she needed another blanket or whether she wanted him to leave the kitchen stove banked longer. He had meant to do this, and then a trapper named Hendricks had come through late with a full pack of furs and a long story about a trail washout on the North Ridge, and by the time Elias had dealt with all of that and finished his ledger entries and turned the lamps down in the main room, it was past midnight, and the trading post was quiet. He was moving through toward his own room at the back when he passed the kitchen. The door was slightly ajar, as it usually was at night, and through the gap came not warmth. The stove had burned down to coals, but the faint orange glow of those coals, and by their light, something that stopped him with his hand on the doorframe and his breath going still in his chest. Clara was not in the storeroom. She was on the kitchen floor. She had dragged her thin wool blanket from the storeroom, and she was lying on the bare pine planks just in front of the stove, curled on her side with the blanket pulled around her shoulders, her cheek resting against the floor, her auburn hair loose from its pins and spreading out across the planks in the dim copper light. She was asleep, deeply, silently asleep, the sleep of someone too cold and too tired to maintain any other state. Her shawl was draped over the blanket for extra warmth. Even so, her hands, tucked together under her chin, looked pale. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment and felt something happen inside him that he did not have an immediate word for. It was not precisely pity. Pity has a distance to it that this did not have. It was closer to the feeling of seeing something that was wrong in a way that required being made right, combined with something older and harder to name, something that had to do with the particular vulnerability of a woman asleep on a cold floor, because no one had thought to take better care of her, and the anger he felt about that was aimed mostly at himself. He backed away from the kitchen door without making a sound. He went to his own room and opened the cedar chest at the foot of his bed. Inside were the things he had accumulated and kept: extra blankets, a bear hide he had taken the previous winter, heavy wool socks he had bought in bulk from the Denver supply. He took out 2 of the heaviest wool blankets, thick ones, the kind made up at the mill in Boulder that were dense enough to hold heat through the worst of the mountain nights. He also took the bearskin. He went back to the kitchen. He moved with the particular care of a large man trying not to be heard, slowly, with his weight distributed, his boots barely sounding on the floor. He crossed to where Clara slept and he crouched down. The floor was cold against his knees, even through his denim trousers. He could see, up close, the faint trembling in her shoulders. Not a shiver exactly, more the tension of a body that had been maintaining itself against cold for too long. He unfolded the first heavy wool blanket and laid it over her, over the thin blanket and the shawl, smoothing it down carefully. Then he unfolded the second and did the same. The bear hide he spread over the top, thick and dark, heavy with warmth. He tucked the edges in around her carefully, the way a man might who had never done this for anyone before, and was learning the motions from some instinct he had not known he possessed. Clara did not wake. Her breathing slowed and deepened within a few minutes, the tension leaving her shoulders as the warmth reached her. Her hands, still tucked under her chin, lost some of their paleness. Elias stayed crouched beside her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. This close, in the dying light of the coals, he could see the particular quality of her face in sleep, the way the lines of tension she carried during the day had softened, the way her lashes lay dark against her cheeks, the way her lips were slightly parted. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has blindsided him, with an expression that has not yet decided what it is. He stood up. He went to the stove and added 2 more pieces of wood from the stack beside it, carefully so that the sound was minimal, just the quiet creak of the iron door and the soft thud of wood on coals. Within a minute the fire was building, and he could feel the warmth beginning to push back against the kitchen's cold. He went to the wooden stool near the door and sat down on it, not to watch her, not in any manner that would have been other than innocent, but because the stove needed tending and would need more wood in another hour, and because he was not, for the moment, inclined to leave. He sat there in the dark and fire-lit kitchen and he tended the stove twice more before the first light of dawn began to show at the kitchen window, a slow gray brightening that came up over the peaks in the east and sent thin bars of light across the pine floor. He had not slept. He had sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his thoughts moving through him in a way he did not try to control or organize, letting them go where they went. When the light was enough to see by and the kitchen was properly warm for the first time all night, Clara stirred. She made a small sound, something between a sigh and an exhale, and then she was still again. Then she moved again, and this time her hand came out from under her chin and touched the bear hide with an expression of confused surprise that crossed her sleeping face. Her eyes opened. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling, taking inventory of the warmth she had not gone to sleep with. Then she turned her head and found Elias sitting on the stool 5 feet away with his elbows on his knees, watching the stove, his profile lit orange from the fire inside. Clara stared at him. He did not look at her immediately. He gave her the moment to understand what she was seeing without the added weight of his gaze. Then he looked over. Their eyes met in the dim kitchen light, and Clara felt something happen to her chest, a swift and inexplicable pressure, like the feeling of altitude change but in her rib cage instead of her ears. She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he looked back with the storm gray ones, and the kitchen was full of the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the fire and the pale gray rose light of very early morning coming through the window. Her eyes filled. She did not cry. She was not, by nature or by circumstance, a woman who cried easily, and she did not cry now. But her eyes went bright and full, and her mouth, pressed together, went slightly unsteady. "You sat here," she said. Her voice was rough from sleep and quiet as a confession. "Stove needed tending," he said. She looked at him for a long moment more, and then she looked down at the bear hide and touched it with her hand, and he saw the exact moment when she understood not just what he had done, but the particular quality of care with which he had done it, the 2 blankets layered beneath, the wood added to the stove, the hours in the dark. "All night?" she asked. "Near enough," he said. Clara pressed her lips together and looked at the floor in front of her for a moment, gathering herself. When she looked back up, her eyes were still bright. "Thank you," she said. And it was not the thanks of social courtesy. It was the real kind, the kind that comes from a place a person does not open to very many people. He nodded once, the way he did when something was acknowledged and did not require more words than it had already been given. "I should have told you about the storeroom earlier," he said. "That is my fault, not yours. Tonight I will move the extra wood stove from the supply barn into the storeroom. You should not be sleeping on the floor." Something in Clara's expression did something complicated, a flicker of something that was almost amusement, almost wonder, almost some other thing she did not have a name for yet. "You're going to move an entire wood stove before breakfast?" "No," he said, standing up from the stool and rolling his shoulders with the unconscious ease of a man whose body was simply built for such things. "After breakfast. I will see to the animals first." And then he went out the kitchen door into the cold morning, and Clara sat on the pine floor, wrapped in his blankets and his bear hide, and she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and she let the tears that had been gathering finally spill over, quietly, into the empty kitchen where no one saw them but the fire. She did not know then what to call what was happening in her chest. She had been careful, coming to Ember Creek, about not calling any feeling by a name it had not yet earned. She had been careful about Elias Calloway in particular, because he was the kind of man that a woman with good instincts and a bad history was careful about, not because there was anything threatening in him, but precisely because there was not. He was solid and capable, and he said things directly, and he had not once looked at her with anything other than the particular regard of a man who sees a person and not an inconvenience or an opportunity. And that was exactly the kind of man it was dangerous to feel things about before you knew whether those feelings had anywhere to land. But sitting in the warming kitchen in the early morning with his blankets around her, she was honest with herself in the way that early morning and recent tears permitted. She was already part way to feeling something, and it had been happening for days. She got up, folded the blankets neatly, draped the bear hide over the chair, and started the morning's fire properly. She made biscuits and put the bacon on and got the coffee going, and when Elias came back in from the barn with snow on his boots and cold radiating off his coat, she set the full plate in front of him with a steadiness that did not betray anything except competence. He sat down and pulled off his gloves and looked at the plate, and then up at her, and he said, "You made enough for yourself?" "I did," she said. He picked up his fork. "Good." She sat down across the table from him, which she did not always do, had not made a habit of doing, and they ate breakfast together in the early morning light, the snow beginning outside the window, the fire going in the stove, and the space between them charged with something neither of them had yet put into words. He moved the wood stove that afternoon. It was a cast-iron stove from the supply barn, not large but solid, and it took the better part of 2 hours for him to carry it over, set it in the storeroom corner, and run the flue pipe through the wall with the careful rigor he brought to all structural work. He did this without asking for help, though Reuben Marsh, who worked the trading post counter 3 days a week, offered twice. Elias carried the stove himself, each component, his shoulders and arms doing work that would have required 2 average men, and then he crouched on the storeroom floor and fitted the pipe sections together with his large hands, with a precision that seemed incongruous with the size of them, until you understood that those hands had built most of what he owned from the ground up, and knew the difference between forcing a fit and finding one. Clara stood in the doorway and watched him work. She watched the flecks of muscle across his back and shoulders under the flannel shirt, the way he moved with absolute economy, no wasted effort, every motion purposeful. She watched the concentration on his face, the slight furrow between his dark brows, the set of his jaw, the way his lips pressed together when he was fitting something that required exactness. She felt the warmth she'd been trying to keep at a responsible distance, doing something considerably less responsible in her chest. When he was done, he stood up and tested the draw and pronounced it sufficient, and then he looked at her in the doorway and said, "There is enough wood stacked on the side of the barn to keep this going through the worst of the winter. I will show you how to bank it so it lasts through the night." "I know how to bank a stove," she said. "Right," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one, which from Elias Calloway was a significant expression. "Of course you do." That evening, for the first time, after supper was cleared and the dishes done, Clara did not retreat to her storeroom or her kitchen routines. She came into the main room where Elias was doing his accounts, and she sat down in the chair by the fireplace with her mending, and she simply existed in the same room as him, and he let her do it without comment, without making anything of it, just continuing his work while she did hers. After an hour, he looked up from his ledger. "Where were you before the railroad camp?" he asked, not because he had been waiting for the right moment, but because the question had surfaced, and he saw no reason to pretend it had not. Clara looked up from her mending. "St. Louis," she said. "Before that, Ohio. I was born in a small town in Ohio." "What brought you to St. Louis?" She was quiet for a moment, threading her needle with a deliberateness that was partly skill and partly consideration of how much truth to give. "A man," she said, and then looked up at him directly because she was not the kind of woman who said something like that, and then retreated from it. "I was 19. He was charming in the way that men who are going to disappoint you are usually charming at the beginning, and he had a good job at the rail company, and he seemed like a solid future, and when he offered to bring me to St. Louis, I said yes." "He did not turn out to be a solid future," Elias said. "It was not a question." "He turned out to be married," Clara said, with a flatness that had long since finished being angry and arrived at something more like resigned clarity. "I found out after a year. I left immediately. But a young woman alone in a city where she has no family, and a reputation that is now considered questionable, does not have a great many options." "So you went to the railroad camp?" "So I went to the railroad camp, which was hard work and honest wages, and no one there cared much about St. Louis, and that suited me." Elias was looking at her with those gray eyes that held a quality she had started to be able to read. It was not sympathy exactly, and it was certainly not judgment. It was the expression of a man who found a thing true and was registering it as true and giving it the weight it deserved. "He was a fool," Elias said simply, and went back to his ledger. Clara looked at him for a moment with her needle suspended, Something warm and quiet moved through her like a hand pressing a wrinkle flat. She went back to her mending. "What about you?" she asked after a little while. He turned a page in the ledger. "What about me? You built this trading post alone. You run it alone. You have for 4 years from what I can gather." She paused, choosing words. "Why are you alone?" The fire shifted, sending a crackle through the room. Elias was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is not avoidance, but processing, the kind that means a man is deciding whether the question deserves the real answer. "I had a partner," he said finally, "not a wife, a man named Thomas Webb. We came up from New Mexico together to establish the post. We had been friends for 11 years. He was quiet again. "He was killed in a rockslide on the North Trail in the spring of 1871, the second year." Clara stopped mending. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it with a directness that matched the directness of his telling. "He was a good man," Elias said. "After that, there did not seem to be much point in having a partner. Things that could be done alone, I did alone." "That seems like a hard way to live." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face that was open in a way it had not been before, not many degrees, but measurably. "It was," he said. "I'm not sure I noticed it was hard until recently." Clara held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her mending, and her needle moved again, but she was not seeing the cloth. She was sitting with the particular weight of what he had just said and what it implied, and she was being, as she had promised herself she would be, careful. But careful was getting harder with every evening like this one. November came down off the peaks with its full authority, and with it came snow that meant serious business, not the exploratory flurries of late October, but the sustained heavy falls that turned the ridgelines white and made the pine forest silent and thick. The supply wagon schedule shifted to once a month, and the trappers who came through had frost in their beards and the preoccupied look of men who were calculating warmth and distance with every step. The trading post became, in November, a smaller world. There was still business, trappers coming in, the occasional prospector, the half-dozen families who had staked homesteads in the valley below and needed supplies. Reuben Marsh came in his 3 days with his particular quiet competence. But the long evenings became longer, and the radius of human warmth contracted to the trading post and the people in it. And for Elias and Clara, that meant the evenings by the fire grew longer and the conversations grew deeper without either of them quite declaring that this was happening. They talked about everything over those November evenings, about Ohio and New Mexico and the respective geographies of their childhoods, about the politics of the silver mines and what they were doing to the mountain towns, the way boom towns filled and then emptied and left their shells behind, about books which both of them had read more of than might have been expected, passing dog-eared copies across the table with brief recommendations that were sometimes arguments in disguise. They argued about the proper way to make cornbread, a disagreement that became an actual bake-off one Wednesday afternoon with Reuben Marsh as the unwilling judge, and which Clara won by a margin that Elias conceded with a raised eyebrow and a second piece taken without comment. He made her laugh one evening in the second week of November, a real laugh, deep and genuine, not the polite kind, when he described his first attempt at making bread alone after Thomas Webb's death, which had produced something he compared to a wheel chock from the supply wagon. Clara laughed so hard she had to put her mending down, and Elias watched her laugh with an expression that was the quietest and most open thing his face had ever done. She made him laugh too, which was rarer and felt different, the low, surprised laugh of a man who has a sense of humor that has been somewhat idle for want of the right company. It came out on a Thursday evening when she described the particular horror of attempting to serve a full camp dinner for 40 railroad workers during a rainstorm, when the camp's only large pot had developed a crack, and she had been obliged to cook in shifts using every vessel she owned, including a washtub she had borrowed from the camp laundress. He laughed and then looked at her with those gray eyes bright for a moment, and she felt the warmth of it like a thing she wanted to keep. On the 14th of November, 3 things happened in quick succession that changed the situation in a way that could not be walked back from. The first was a man named Garrett Cole, who arrived at the trading post on a bay horse at noon on a Wednesday, dusted with trail snow and carrying himself with the loose, confident ease of a man who had decided that other people's property was a concept that applied to other people. He was perhaps 35, handsome in a way that had too much awareness of itself, and he came in to buy ammunition and ended up staying for 2 hours, during which time he made a point of watching Clara work in a way that was not accidental or innocent, and twice made remarks to Elias about the quality of his cook that were framed as compliments, but had an edge to them that made Clara's hands still on the dishwater. Elias had noticed. He noticed everything. And he noticed this with a particular sharpening of attention that did not announce itself in his expression, but was visible, if you knew how to look, in the set of his jaw and the way his body reoriented very slightly to position itself between Cole and the kitchen door. He answered Cole's questions about the trail conditions to the south with complete information and no warmth, and when Cole finally pushed back his chair and said he had better be moving on and threw one more look toward the kitchen, Elias said quietly, but with an absolute lack of ambiguity, "The trail south is clear as long as you move before the afternoon weather." It was not, by any measure, a threat. It was simply a sentence that contained within it the clear expectation of a timeline. Cole had smiled, the smile of a man who recognized a border when he encountered one, and left. Clara came out of the kitchen after Cole's horse sounds faded and found Elias standing at the front window watching the trail. She stood beside him, and they were both quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and it had the same quality as the first time she had said it to him in the kitchen before sunrise. He was not going to get very far, Elias said, and he meant it with a total simplicity that she found, paradoxically, more affecting than something more elaborate would have been. The second thing that happened on the 14th of November was that a letter arrived in the supply bundle from a lawyer in Denver regarding a land dispute on the eastern boundary of Elias's property, a claim by a mining company that had been circling for 2 years and had finally decided to file formally. Elias read the letter at the kitchen table while Clara made the noon meal, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions that were restrained but readable to her now. The flat, controlled anger, the measuring calculation, the specific set of his jaw that meant he was deciding what to do rather than simply reacting. "How bad is it?" she asked, setting a bowl of stew in front of him. He looked up. "They want the eastern 40 acres. There's a silver seam running through that land that their surveyor identified last spring. Without that 40 acres, I lose access to the upper creek for water rights. Can they do that? File on land you already hold?" "They can file. Whether they can win is a different question." He looked at the letter again. "I will need to go to Denver. I need to see the land registry in person and make sure my original claim documents are on file correctly. If they are, the case is weak. If there was a recording error at some point..." He stopped. "When do you have to go?" "Before the first week of December. After that, the mountain passes will be inaccessible until spring." Clara looked at him. She was standing with her hand on the back of the chair across from him, and she was thinking something that she made a decision about before she had fully finished thinking it. "Take me with you," she said. He looked up from the letter. "I have never been to Denver," she said, which was not entirely the real reason, but was a real reason. "And you will need someone to manage meals on the trail, and I can read well enough to be useful with documents if you need another set of eyes, and..." She stopped because the other reason was pressing and she had run out of practical ones to put in front of it. Elias looked at her with those gray eyes for a long moment. "It will be 4 days on the trail each way," he said. "The weather in November is unpredictable. It will be cold and the conditions will be rough." "I was in a railroad camp for 2 years," she said. "I know what rough conditions are." He looked at her for another moment. Then he folded the letter. "All right," he said. The third thing that happened on the 14th of November was that at the end of the evening, when the fire had burned down low and Clara had gathered her mending to go to bed, she stood up, and they were in the same space, closer than usual, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the moment lasted several seconds too long to be accidental. "Good night, Elias," she said eventually. "Good night, Clara," he said, and his voice was different, not by much, just a shade lower and quieter, but she heard it. She went to her room with the new stove going warm and her thoughts considerably less organized than they had been at the start of the evening. They left for Denver on the 18th of November, at first light, with 2 horses, Elias's large roan gelding, Atlas, and the steady gray mare he kept for customers' use, whose name was Patience, which Clara found either appropriate or ironic depending on the day. He had packed the saddlebags with care, with the attention to weight distribution and practical necessity that characterized everything he did physically. And he had, without announcement, added to Clara's bags an extra set of his heaviest wool socks and a pair of leather gloves lined with rabbit fur that he said he had been intending to sell but had not got around to. She had put them on before they had been out an hour, because the morning cold was serious, and she had watched her own gloved hands on the reins and felt something quiet and warm in her chest that had nothing to do with the fur lining. The trail from Ember Creek to Denver wound south through the mountain passes for the first day and a half, through country that was brutally beautiful. Granite faces catching the winter light, pines standing in their deep green under accumulated snow, the sky at altitude an intense, saturated blue that seemed to come from somewhere above the atmosphere. Clara, who had come to Ember Creek in the back of a supply wagon and had not had much attention to spare for the landscape, now had the leisure to look at it properly, and she found herself turning in her saddle repeatedly to take in something new and striking. Elias, watching her look at the mountains with that particular expression, open in a way she was not always open, surprised by beauty in a way that was not performative but entirely genuine, felt the tightening in his chest that had been building for weeks now arrive at something that required acknowledging. He was in love with her. He had been, if he was honest, for most of the month, but he had a particular method of being honest with himself about things that had potentially large consequences. He held them at arm's length until he was sure they were real and not merely immediate, and then he acknowledged them plainly and thought about what came next. What came next was not yet decided, because Clara had been careful and he had respected that carefulness, recognizing it as the product of experience and not of disinterest. But he knew what he was feeling, and it was not small or temporary, and it had been confirmed somewhere around the time he had watched her laugh at the cornbread story, and felt, for the first time in years, like the trading post and Ember Creek, and the future that extended out from them contained something he genuinely wanted. The first night on the trail, they camped in a dry hollow below the snow line, and Elias built a fire in the precise, methodical way he did everything outdoors, and Clara cooked the provisions she had packed over it with equal precision, and they ate elk jerky and pan biscuits and drank coffee that tasted better than it had any right to given the conditions. And Clara said so, and Elias said that altitude and wood smoke improved all coffee, and she said that was either philosophy or nonsense, and he said those were not always different things, and she laughed again, and it echoed off the granite in the dark in a way that made the mountains feel, briefly, inhabited. That night the cold came down, and Clara, wrapped in her blankets and positioned as close to the banked fire as was safe, was warmer than she had been on the kitchen floor in October, and she fell asleep quickly. Elias, sitting up against the rock face with his rifle across his knees, out of the habit of years in open country, watched the fire and watched the surrounding dark, and did not permit himself to watch Clara sleep, because that was a line he had drawn for himself and intended to keep. But he was aware of the sound of her breathing, steady and at ease in the dark, and it was company of a kind he had not known he missed. The second day of travel brought them out of the mountain passes and into the foothills, and by afternoon the terrain had shifted to the rolling grassland and scrub oak country that marked the approach to Denver. The air was still cold but less ferocious, and they could move faster on flatter ground. And somewhere in the middle of that afternoon, with the horses at an easy canter and the light coming flat and golden off the plains, Elias pulled Atlas alongside Patience and said without particular preamble, "I am glad you came with me." Clara looked over at him from under the brim of her bonnet, and her amber eyes were warm and direct. "So am I," she said. They rode in silence for a bit, the comfortable kind, the kind that had evolved between them over weeks of living in the same space and finding that they did not need to fill all of it. "Clara," he said. "Yes?" He was quiet for a moment, which with Elias meant he was deciding on words rather than sentiment. The sentiment was already settled. "When this is done, the land business, the winter, when spring comes, I want to talk about what happens after that." She looked at him steadily, her horse keeping pace with his. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, with the particular straightforward quality that was either courage or simplicity or both, "that I would like to stop conducting myself as though I am not thinking about you nearly all of the time, and I would like to know whether that is something you are open to." Clara felt her heart do something decisive in her chest. She looked at the plains ahead, and then back at him, at the strong lines of his face against the winter sky, the breadth of his shoulders, the gray eyes that were, she realized, looking at her with everything in them that she had been reading in pieces for weeks now, all of it at once. "Yes," she said, "I'm open to that." He looked at her for a moment more, and then the corner of his mouth moved, the real version, more than the nearly smile, a full one, slow and transformative on that weathered face, and it was so unexpectedly beautiful that she had to look back at the trail to collect herself. They rode into Denver the following morning, checked into the respectable boarding house on Larimer Street that Elias had used before, and spent 2 long days in the land registry and the offices of a lawyer named Hartwell, who had the kind of meticulous mind that enjoyed nothing more than a clear title dispute. The original claim documents were there, properly recorded, and Hartwell said with the satisfied precision of a man who knew he was right that the mining company's case was based on a survey error and would not survive a formal challenge. Elias would need to file a counter-response by December the 5th, and Hartwell would handle the formal submission. On the second evening in Denver, with the legal business resolved and one evening free before the journey back, Elias took Clara to dinner at the restaurant on Blake Street that had tablecloths and actual candles rather than tallow lamps, and served beef that had not been dried or smoked into its current state. Clara wore the better of her 2 dresses, dark blue wool, simple but with a little lace at the collar, and she had pinned her hair up with a particular care, and when she came down the boarding house stairs, Elias was waiting in the small parlor in a clean shirt and his good coat, and he looked up at her and went very still for a moment in a way that told her everything she needed to know about how she looked. They sat across from each other at a small table with a candle between them, and they ate roast beef and drank wine, actual wine, which neither of them had had in months, and talked and laughed and existed in a way that was different from the kitchen table and the fireside, something more open to the air and the future. He reached across the table at one point and took her hand, just held it, large and warm around her fingers, on the white tablecloth in the candlelight. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "I have not done this in a long time," he said, looking at their hands. "Done what?" "Sat across a table from a woman I wanted to keep sitting across a table from," he said, which was, for Elias, an extraordinarily direct statement, and the directness of it moved through her like warm light. "How long?" she asked. 7 years, he said, and did not elaborate, and she did not press because some things are answered fully by the weight of them. She turned her hand in his and held it back. "I think I have been waiting to trust someone again for almost that long," she said quietly. "It is a strange feeling when you find out that you can." He looked at her across the candlelight with those gray eyes that were, in this light, warmer than she had ever seen them, and he said, "I will not give you reason to feel otherwise." She believed him completely, which was the extraordinary thing about it. They rode back to Ember Creek over 2 days through early winter country, and the trail was harder than the way down had been. Snow had come in on the mountain passes, and the horses worked harder through the drifts, and the nights were colder. But there was something different about the journey back, some quality of the space between them that had changed, that made the cold more manageable, and the camp at night feel like something other than endurance. He sat closer to her at the fire. She passed him the coffee, with her fingers brushing his deliberately, and neither of them looked away. On the last night before Ember Creek, camped on the south-facing ledge that marked the last descent into the valley, she sat beside him at the fire rather than across from it, their shoulders touching, and they talked for a long time about what they each wanted, not in abstract philosophical terms, but in the practical, direct language of 2 people who have been practical enough about life to know that wanting and having require a plan. Clara wanted to stay in Ember Creek, she said. She had not had a place that felt like it might become permanent in a long time, and Ember Creek, cold and small and perched on its granite ridges, had begun to feel like that might be possible. She wanted to keep cooking, but perhaps grow the kitchen side of the trading post into something more formal, a proper eating establishment, since the town had nothing of the sort, and the traffic through the post was enough to support it. Elias listened to this with the particular focus of a man registering important information. He said that he had been thinking about the same thing, that the trading post had the traffic, but had never developed that side of the business, because he had not had someone with the skill or the interest to run it. "I could build you a proper kitchen," he said, looking at the fire, "bigger than what we have now, with a proper range, not just the stove. There is room on the east side of the post to extend." Clara looked at him in the firelight. "You would do that?" "I built the trading post," he said, with a simplicity that was not boasting but simply the statement of what was true. "I can build a kitchen." She looked at him for a long moment, this man beside her on the rock ledge with the mountains around them and the fire going between them and the future, opening up with a clarity she had not felt since she had been young enough to believe in clear futures without the fine print. "I like you very much, Elias Calloway," she said, which was, given the weight of what she was actually feeling, a considerable understatement, but she was still being careful, still honoring the care that honest things required. He looked at her with those warm gray eyes, and he said very quietly, "I like you considerably more than very much, Clara Holt." And then, in the firelight on the mountain, he kissed her. It was not urgent or desperate. It was slow and certain, the way he did everything, and it tasted of wood smoke and coffee, and his hand came up and held her face with a gentleness that seemed almost improbable in hands that large, and she closed her eyes and felt, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They rode into Ember Creek the next morning, through a light snowfall that made the town look clean and muffled, and if Reuben Marsh, who was opening the trading post counter when they arrived, noticed anything different about the quality of the silence between them. He was a wise enough man not to say so directly. December in Ember Creek was a month of cold and close spaces, and Elias began the kitchen extension as soon as the land dispute was formally answered, and Hartwell confirmed the mining company had withdrawn their claim, which happened by letter on December the 8th. He worked on the extension in the afternoons when the trading post was slower, his breath making clouds in the freezing air, his hammer ringing out across the snow-covered yard in the kind of rhythmic determination that was entirely characteristic of him. Clara brought him coffee, sometimes twice, and stood in the open frame of the new extension and watched him work and felt something settle deeper into her chest with each visit. He had drawn up a plan, an actual sketch, on brown paper with measurements and notes, for the new kitchen, and she had stood at the table with him studying it, their heads close together, her finger tracing the lines and asking questions about the placement of the range and the angle of the window to catch the morning light, and his shoulder had been warm against hers, and neither of them had moved apart. Christmas came to Ember Creek quietly, the way it came to mining towns, with a sense of people being aware of what they were far from and deciding to make something decent out of where they were instead. Clara made a proper Christmas dinner for the trading post, which Elias had opened to the town's residents without announcement, simply leaving the word with Reuben Marsh to pass along. 7 people came, which was most of Ember Creek's non-transient population: Reuben and his wife, Margaret, the homesteading family from the valley below, the Lindquists, with their 3 children, and a trapper named Old Caldwell, who had been wintering near Ember Creek for a decade and had no family anywhere near. Clara made roast elk and baked potatoes and a dried apple pie that Old Caldwell declared the finest thing he had eaten since his wife's kitchen in 1851, which was high praise given the span of years it covered. The trading post was warm and full of the smell of food and wood fire and the sound of people being glad to be together, and Clara moved through it all with a capability and a warmth that made Elias, watching from the back of the room with his arms crossed, feel a kind of contentment so complete it was almost disorienting. Later, after everyone had gone and the dishes were done and the fire had burned low, Elias gave Clara her Christmas gift. It was a small box wrapped in brown paper, and inside it was a journal, a proper bound one with good paper, brought back from Denver and kept hidden since November. He knew she wrote, had seen her at it in the evenings, and the journal she had was nearly full. Clara held it and looked at the cover, dark blue cloth like her dress, and looked up at him with her amber eyes bright. "How did you know?" she asked. "I watch you," he said with the simple honesty that was entirely his. She stood up on her toes and kissed him, and his arms came around her in the empty trading post on Christmas night, and the fire crackled and the snow fell outside the window, and it was enough. It was precisely enough. January arrived, and January in the Colorado Rockies was not gentle or forgiving, but inside the trading post it was warm, and the new kitchen extension was framed, and the range had been ordered from Denver on the supply wagon and was expected by February. And Elias and Clara moved through the days with the easy, unself-conscious closeness of two people who had made a private decision about each other and were living inside that decision with comfort and certainty. The conversations they had in January were different from the November ones. They were building conversations, not exploring ones. Where do you want the bread shelves? Should the eating area have 4 tables or 5? What would you name it if you named it? This last one from Elias, which was unusual, for he was not ordinarily inclined toward hypothetical questions. But he asked it one evening when they were both in the new kitchen frame, looking at the space, and she had turned and looked at him, surprised by the question. "Name what?" she asked. "The eating establishment," he said. "If it has a name, it will draw more attention, something on a sign on the main post." Clara thought about it, her hand on the rough new timber of the wall. "Calloway's," she said, and then stopped, aware of what she had just said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said entirely steadily, "That would require either an amendment to the deed of the property or a change in your name." Clara held very still. "Is one of those options on the table?" she asked, and her voice was quiet but steady. "Both of them," he said, "but I would prefer the second." She looked at him in the winter evening light coming through the open frame of the new kitchen, this man who had sat on a stool in the dark and tended a fire all night so she would be warm, who had moved a wood stove with his own hands, who had put the land dispute in order and ridden through mountain passes in November and held her hand across a candlelit table and built her a kitchen in the Colorado winter. And she said, without a single reservation remaining in her anywhere, "So would I." He proposed properly the next evening, with no ring yet, but a seriousness that made rings seem like accessories rather than evidence. He said everything he meant in the way he always said everything, directly and without waste, and with a completeness that left nothing ambiguous. He told her that she was the most capable person he had known, and the most honest, and that being in her company was the only time in 7 years that the trading post had felt like something other than just the place he had built. He told her he intended to take care of her for as long as she permitted him to, and that he did not expect perfection from her or the future, and he hoped she did not expect it from him, but that what he could give her was his full attention and his loyalty and the work of his hands and the honest contents of his character, whatever those were worth. Clara, sitting across the kitchen table from him with her mending forgotten in her lap, cried while he said this. Not the quiet morning tears of October, proper, streaming, thoroughly unguarded tears, because she was in the presence of a man she loved absolutely, and who loved her back in exactly the same degree, and it was almost too much to be inside her own chest. He handed her his handkerchief, which he produced from his shirt pocket with such calm readiness that she laughed even while she was crying, and said, "You were prepared." "I had a feeling," he said. She said yes through the handkerchief, and he came around the table and pulled her up and held her with his arms around her and his chin on the top of her head, and she pressed her face against his flannel shirt and breathed and felt the mountain outside and the fire inside and the extraordinary, ordinary safety of being held by someone who had chosen to hold you. They married in March of 1874, when the passes cleared enough for the circuit preacher to make his rounds. The ceremony was held in the trading post, conducted by Reverend Alcott, who was a thin, cheerful man in a coat that had seen better decades and who performed marriages with the same practical warmth with which he did everything else in his circuit. The witnesses were Reuben and Margaret Marsh, and old Caldwell, who wore a clean shirt for the occasion and cried without apology, and 3 other residents of Ember Creek who had felt the general warmth of the Calloway trading post over the winter months and came because it seemed right. Clara wore her blue dress with her hair down for the first time in Ember Creek, loose and auburn and long, the way Elias had seen it only once before on the kitchen floor in October. He looked at her when she came through from the back room, and his face did the full, slow, transformative thing with its expression that she had come to love more than almost anything. that complete and unguarded openness that he kept for moments that deserved it. Reverend Alcott pronounced them husband and wife, and Elias kissed her with the same certain unhurried quality as the first time on the mountain, and the small company of witnesses cheered, and Reuben Marsh opened the bottle of good whiskey he had been keeping for a suitable occasion, and Clara Calloway laughed in the trading post with her husband's hand warm in hers, and felt that the word home, which had been a complicated and somewhat painful word for her for a long time, had become simple again. The new kitchen opened in April 1874, when the range arrived from Denver on the spring supply wagon, and Elias installed it with his characteristic thoroughness. The sign above the door, burned into a plank of pine by Elias's own hand, the letters sure and clean, read Calloway's. Within a week of opening, it was the talk of the valley. Word spread the way word spreads in mountain country, carried by trappers and prospectors and homesteaders, passed from horse to horse and campfire to campfire, that there was a place in Ember Creek where you could get a proper meal cooked by a woman who knew what she was doing, and that the coffee alone was worth the ride. Business grew through the spring and into the summer. Clara hired a girl from one of the homestead families, a steady, practical 16-year-old named Anna Lindquist, to help with the washing up and the serving, and the kitchen ran with the organized efficiency of a woman who had cooked under genuinely difficult conditions and knew how to manage a busy service without drama. Elias, meanwhile, expanded the trading post supply side to accommodate the increased foot traffic, built 2 additional shelving bays in the main room, and spent 3 weeks in May constructing a proper storage cellar below the kitchen extension for Clara's provisions. He did this with the same complete physicality that he brought to all construction, spending full days digging and laying stone in the low, cramped space, emerging each evening covered in rock dust and in a state of thorough tiredness that Clara addressed by making sure his supper was hot and his coffee was strong, and by sitting with him after, in the easy quiet of their shared evenings, her hand in his. Summer in Ember Creek was brief and brilliant, the kind of season that seemed especially vivid because it was surrounded by so much cold, the wildflowers coming up in the meadows below the trading post. In colors that seemed implausibly saturated, the creeks running full and cold with snowmelt, the sky at high altitude so intensely blue that looking at it too long felt like a physical sensation. On a Wednesday evening in June, Clara told Elias she was expecting. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going over a supply invoice, and she came and stood beside his chair and told him, and he was very still for a moment in the way he was still when something required being properly received before it could be responded to. Then he turned in his chair and put his arm around her waist and pulled her close to him, her hip against his shoulder, and he pressed his face briefly against her side in a gesture that was purely instinctive and entirely unlike his usual composure, and she put her hand on the back of his head, and they stayed like that for a moment in the kitchen they had built together, with the evening light coming through the window and the mountains visible through the glass, and neither of them said anything because neither of them needed to. He was enormously protective through the pregnancy in the particular practical way that was entirely characteristic of him. He did not fuss, did not treat her as though she had become fragile. He knew her well enough to know she would not accept or appreciate that. But he noticed things and acted on them without announcement. The bucket for water, which she normally drew herself from the well, was never empty. The woodpile by the kitchen door was restocked before it needed restocking. He came into the kitchen at noon every day, regardless of what was happening in the trading post, and sat with her for 20 minutes while she took the break she did not always remember to take herself. In the evenings, he ran his hand across her back when he passed behind her at the stove, and in the mornings, he was up before her to have the kitchen warm. The summer of 1874 passed in work and warmth and the steady building of a life that was becoming richer and more layered with each season. Reuben Marsh's wife, Margaret, became a genuine friend to Clara, coming to the kitchen on her quiet afternoons to drink coffee and talk about the homesteads, about the comings and goings of the town, about the particular ongoing negotiation between the mining companies and the town council that Elias followed with a careful eye as someone who owned land. Margaret was a forthright, funny woman who had been in Ember Creek almost since its beginning and knew everything about everyone, And she had taken to Clara from early on with the warmth of a person who recognizes capability and straightness when she sees it. In September, old Caldwell got sick. Not mildly sick, the kind of sick that a man of his years and his long winters in rough country eventually encountered. A chest sickness that settled into him with a permanence that the doctor from the next valley down was honest about. Elias rode to fetch the doctor and brought him himself, and Clara opened the bunkhouse at the back of the trading post and had a fire going and a bed made before the doctor arrived. And Caldwell spent the last 2 months of 1874 in the bunkhouse, being quietly and consistently looked after by both of them. He died in November, peacefully, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, with snow coming down outside the window and Clara sitting with him because he had asked her to. She held his hand and talked to him about Ohio, which she thought might be a gentler destination for his mind than wherever else it might go. And he died with his eyes closed and his face relaxed, and the snow falling outside like a benediction. Elias buried him on the ridge above the trading post, in a place where the pines opened up and you could see the full sweep of the valley below. He did it himself, digging through the frozen ground with the determination of a man who understood that some things were owed and not optional. He carved the marker from pine with his own hands, and it said, "Phineas Caldwell, trapper and a good man." At the graveside, in the cold and the snow, he stood with his hat in his hands, and Clara stood beside him with her hand through his arm, and her breath making white clouds in the still air. And he said quietly, "He was the first person to come into the trading post the day I opened it. He bought a pound of tobacco and said, 'Well, this might do all right.' That was all. He came back every winter after that." Clara pressed her hand tighter on his arm. "He came back because it was worth coming back to," she said. Elias looked at the marker for a moment more. "I think he knew that last winter was different," he said. "When he came back in December, I think he knew it was the last one, and he came back anyway." He was quiet. "I'm glad he was here." "So am I," she said. They walked back down the ridge together through the snow, and inside the trading post the fire was going, and the smell of the kitchen was warm and real. And they were home. Their son was born on the 4th of February, 1875, on the coldest night of that winter, in the upstairs room that Elias had finished building the previous fall with precisely this occasion in mind. The doctor came from 2 valleys over and arrived just in time, which was close enough that Elias, who had been managing his composure with increasingly visible effort throughout the day, was white around the mouth by the time boots were heard on the porch. It was a long labor and not an easy one, and Elias spent most of it in the hallway outside the room in a state of controlled and unwilling helplessness that was entirely new to him and entirely awful. He could hear Clara's labor through the door, and he could hear the doctor's voice and Margaret Marsh's voice. She had come the moment Elias had sent Reuben for her, and he stood in the hallway with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and all his considerable physical capability entirely useless. And he found this more difficult than anything the mountain had ever thrown at him. When the baby's first cry came through the door, he went very still, and then he put his back against the wall and his hands against his face and breathed for a long moment. Margaret came out first and said, with the particular satisfied warmth of a woman who had been through this herself and recognized the essential rightness of it, "You have a son, Elias, and your wife is asking for you." He went in. Clara was pale and exhausted in the way of someone who has accomplished something enormous and is now resting on the other side of it, her hair loose against the pillow, her face carrying the specific serenity of the completely spent. The baby was wrapped in the blanket she had spent 3 months making, the one with the dark blue edging, and she held him against her chest. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, and she turned the baby toward him, and he looked at his son, at the red, squinted, wholly unremarkable and entirely extraordinary face of a person who had not existed yesterday, and felt something in him rearrange permanently. He looked up at Clara. Her amber eyes were warm and tired and full of something that required no words. He picked up her free hand and held it with both of his, and he said, "You were magnificent." She smiled, not the polite smile or the guarded one, the real, full one, the one that made the rest of her face do something wonderful. "I was not feeling very magnificent at the time." "You were," he said. "You always are." They named him Thomas James Calloway, the Thomas for Thomas Webb, which Elias had said quietly one evening and Clara had agreed to without hesitation, understanding what it meant and giving it the weight it deserved. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and substantial, with his father's dark hair and his mother's amber eyes, which became apparent by the spring. He was a calm baby who observed the world with a focused, considering expression that made Margaret Marsh say he looked like his father, thinking about a supply invoice, which made Clara laugh so hard she had to put Thomas down. The years of the later 1870s in Ember Creek were years of building and deepening. Calloway's kitchen grew in reputation, and the eating establishment became the social center of the town as the town itself grew. A second doctor arrived in 1876, a schoolteacher the same year, a newspaper by 1877. Elias served on the town council from 1876 onward, providing the kind of level and practical voice that councils needed when they were inclined to become dramatic, and Clara became the person that people came to when they needed something organized or managed, with the quiet authority of someone who had been competent under difficult conditions long before the town noticed. In 1877, their daughter arrived, Eleanor Ruth Calloway, born in April with a full head of red gold hair and her mother's fine-boned features and an expression from the first hours of apparent indignation at the volume and chaos of the world, which turned out to be entirely characteristic of her. Eleanor was fierce and bright and early to everything, walking, talking, opinions. By the time she was 2, she had informed old Reuben Marsh that he was shelving the cornmeal in the wrong place, which caused Reuben to report this to Elias with an expression of pure bemusement, and Elias to say, without great surprise, that she was probably right. The trading post and the kitchen ran and grew, and the land dispute that the mining company had filed was not the last. There were 2 more challenges over the years, both resolved through Hartwell's careful legal work and Elias's meticulous maintenance of his claim records. The silver in Ember Creek began to play out by the late 1870s, which meant the composition of the town changed. Some left, as boomtowns always shed their most transient populations when the initial rush faded. But the ones who stayed were the ones who had put roots down, and those roots went deeper. On the evening of October the 22nd, 1878, 5 years exactly from the night Elias had found her on the kitchen floor, Clara finished the supper service and came through to the main room where Elias was doing his accounts, which was a thing he still did every evening by the fire in the same chair with the same lamp, because some things are worth keeping. She sat down across from him in the firelight, and he looked up. She was 38 years old, and she looked, he thought, the way she had looked the day she walked into the trading post with her carpet bag, capable and direct and more beautiful than she seemed to be aware of, but with something additional now, something that had been acquired over years rather than arrived with, something like permanence, like a woman who had decided where she was and was entirely at peace with the decision. 5 years today, she said. He looked at her across the firelit room, this man who had built everything around them with his hands, who had sat on a stool in the dark and tended a fire through the night, who had ridden through mountain passes in November and built kitchens and buried friends and held his son for the first time, and watched his daughter organize the cornmeal at age 2 with the expression of a woman who does not tolerate inefficiency. "I know," he said. "Do you remember," she said, "what you were thinking when you found me on the floor?" He set the ledger down. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had not changed, had always been the same, storm-colored and warm when the light was right, and seeing things with a completeness that, still 5 years on, made her feel known in a way that was extraordinary. "I was thinking," he said, "that it was wrong, and that I was going to make it right." "And did you?" "I'm still working on it," he said, which was his way of saying that the work was not a burden but a purpose, and that he intended to continue. Clara smiled. "I think you have made a good start," she said. He stood up from his chair and came to her chair and held out his hand, and she took it, and he pulled her to her feet and kept her hand in his. "I'm going to tell you something I have never said precisely this way," he said, standing in front of her in the firelit main room of the trading post with the mountains outside and their children sleeping upstairs in the kitchen that smelled of the evening's bread and the life they had made together everywhere around them. "All right," she said. "You are the best thing that has ever come into this trading post," he said, "and I intend, for as long as there is any remaining argument to be made about it, to make sure you never sleep on a cold floor again." Clara laughed, the real laugh, the deep one, the one that echoed off the granite in the dark. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest, and his arms came around her with the same certainty they always had, and she felt the whole solidity of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the warmth of him, the absolute and unwavering quality of his presence. And she thought, as she had thought many times in the years between then and now, that the morning she had woken up on the floor and found him sitting in the dark was the morning everything had changed. She had not known it then, fully. She had suspected it. She had felt it, in the amber warmth that had filled her chest that morning with the tears running and the fire going and the bear hide around her shoulders. She had felt something turn over, a page, a season, a door. She knew it completely now. Spring came to Ember Creek in 1879, with the particular enthusiasm of a high mountain spring, sudden and overwhelming and brief, the snowmelt turning the creek loud, and the wildflowers coming up in the lower meadows with a vividness that Thomas, who was 4 years old and firmly in possession of the opinion that the outdoors was primarily interesting, catalogued with great seriousness on walks with his father. Elias took Thomas on these walks with the same attention he gave everything, explaining the names of the plants and the tracks in the soft earth and the way the creek ran fast with snowmelt and would slow in the dry heat of late summer. Thomas listened with the focused, considering expression that was entirely his father's, and asked questions that were, increasingly, very good questions. Eleanor, too, was less interested in categorization and more interested in participation. She went everywhere at a run, had strong opinions about everything in her radius, and had already successfully negotiated with her father for the right to have a name for the trading post's barn cat, which she called General, and whom she addressed as such with full seriousness. Life in Ember Creek in 1879 had a fullness to it that was not the frantic fullness of the Silver Rush years, but the deep settled richness of a place that had found its own character. The trading post and kitchen were the center of that character in a way that felt natural. Elias and Clara Calloway had built something that was not just a business, but a kind of gravity, a place that people moved toward when they needed something real. On a Tuesday afternoon in late May, with the kitchen doing its regular noon service and the trading post busy with the spring traffic of ranchers and trappers stocking up for the warm weather season, Clara looked through the kitchen window at the yard where Elias was helping unload a supply delivery, lifting the crates from the wagon with the same physical ease he had always brought to it, his dark hair longer in the spring warmth, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows, Thomas sitting on the fence nearby, watching with a proprietorial interest. She watched him and felt the same thing she had felt that morning 5 years ago, coming from the same place, except that it was not new now, and it was not uncertain, and it was not careful. It was simply hers, settled into her like the mountains were settled into the granite, like the kitchen was settled into the trading post, like the name Calloway was settled into her. Anna Lindquist, who was now 19 and had become a fixture of the kitchen operation and a close companion of Clara's, came to stand beside her at the window. She had followed Clara's gaze without saying anything. "You know," Anna said after a moment, "he still looks at you the same way he did when I started working here." Clara smiled. "What way is that?" "Like," Anna said, choosing carefully, "like he cannot quite believe his luck." Clara looked out the window at her husband helping with the supply crates, her son on the fence, the mountains in the background, and the spring afternoon light over everything. And she thought about the night she had arrived in Ember Creek with a carpet bag and a face that said she had decided wherever the wagon stopped was better than where she had been. She thought about the kitchen floor and the cold and the bear hide and the fire and the man on the stool in the dark. "He is not the only one," she said. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was clean and the trading post was quiet, Elias and Clara sat together by the fire in the main room with the comfortable layered silence that was the silence of two people who know each other fully. His arm was around her shoulders and her feet were tucked up on the chair, and she had her journal open but was not writing in it, just holding it, and he was looking at the fire with the steady, contained ease of a man who is at peace. "I was thinking today," she said after a while. He turned his head slightly toward her. "About going back to Denver, not for business, just for a few days. I thought we could take the children in the summer, show Thomas the city, let Eleanor alarm the general population." He made the low, surprised laugh that she still treasured. "Eleanor in Denver," he said, in the tone of a man considering the implications. "She would manage it beautifully," Clara said. "She manages everything beautifully, even when she is managing it very loudly." "She does," he agreed, with the unmistakable warmth of a father who has been alarmed and delighted by the same child in the same moment consistently for 2 years. "We should go," Elias said, and she felt the decision in it, immediate and unequivocal, the way he made decisions that were right. "We will take the summer wagon south, stay a week, show them the city." "And the restaurant on Blake Street?" she asked, looking up at him with her amber eyes. He looked down at her, and the corner of his mouth moved, slow and sure. "And the restaurant on Blake Street," he said, "the one with the tablecloths." She settled back against his shoulder and looked at the fire, and the mountain evening was quiet around them, and the trading post held its warmth against the spring cold, and upstairs their children slept in the rooms he had built with his hands. Outside, the peaks were still snow-capped, but the valley below was green, and the creek was loud with melt, and the sign above the kitchen door said Calloway's in the letters he had burned into the pine himself, sure and clean. Everything was named, everything was built, everything was accounted for. And on the 4th of February every year, when the anniversary of Thomas's birth came around, and the winter was at its deepest and the cold was most serious, Elias would always wake before the rest of the house, go down to the kitchen, and have the fire going and the coffee made, and the kitchen warm before Clara came downstairs. Always. Without exception. Without announcement. Because that was who he was, and that was what he did for her, and that was what she meant to him. Warmth before she asked for it, wood on the fire before she was cold, the stool in the dark when no one else would have thought to stay. And Clara would come down in the mornings of those February anniversaries and find the kitchen warm and her husband by the stove with the coffee made, and she would stop in the kitchen doorway for a moment, the same doorway where he had stood in October of 1873, and found her on the floor, and look at him with her amber eyes bright and full. And he would look back at her over his coffee and say, as he had said it every year since the first one, "Stove needed tending." And she would laugh and sit down at the table and accept the coffee he poured, and they would sit together in the warm kitchen with the mountains outside the window, and the children still sleeping upstairs, and the sign on the door, and the years behind them, and the years ahead, and everything between them was full and known and true. It had started on a cold floor, in the dark, before sunrise, with tears she had not intended for him to see. It had become, in the years that followed, the warmest thing she had ever known.